Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to our third installment of the University of Houston Downtown's President's Lecture Series. I'm Lauren Blanchard. I have the unique opportunity to serve as president of the University of Houston Downtown, and I'm quite excited to be here today and to welcome you to the discussion entitled Inclusive Excellence, the Way Forward. Critical conversations on the Houston climate issue, environmental justice, and sustainability. This topic of change is a vital conversation for us to have, and a vital subject that deserves both our attention and our action. Here at UHD, we do more than talk the talk, but we do our very best to walk the walk, and how timely this conversation is. In fact, we are partnering with the City of Houston for a week-long event that starts today. Now through November 19th, the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Sustainability will host its second annual virtual Houston Climate Week. With the support of the University of Houston Downtown, this week-long virtual conference will update the public on the implementation of two particular initiatives: Resilient Houston and Houston Climate Action Plan. This event will provide a platform for local experts to discuss the critical policy concerns relative to aging infrastructure as well as to inequity. More so, this university is also committed to performing the work that is necessary right here with this lecture series. And that's for a specific reason. There's a direct correlation between this lecture series and UHD's institutional compass. As you may recall from the State of the University address and from my interactions with campus community over the months, as well as previous lecture series interactions, the tool I use to steer our campus toward specific priorities is named UHD's Institutional Compass. It serves as a directional guide in all that we do. In it, it points out 4 points of excellence that some of you should be familiar with already: strengthening justice, bolstering student issues and equity, supporting institutional excellence, and growing as an anchor institution. This lecture series today helps UHD to move forward in pursuit of these 4 institutional goals. For this particular discussion, it is my hope that we can learn from each other. Our experiences in addressing climate change and sustainable living, as well as possible solutions to address challenges often associated with these topics. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank the ECMC Foundation. We're thankful for their support, as well as the work that we will get done in the Houston region as a result of their support. It's now my pleasure to turn this lecture over to our moderator, Ms. Natasha Poggio. Professor Poggio is an assistant professor of graphic design in the Department of Arts and Communication. She holds a bachelor's degree in fine arts from the University of Buenos Aires and a master's degree of fine arts from the University of Texas, Austin. Before joining UHD in 2018, she taught at Lamar University, and she also taught visual communications design at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. As a social impact design educator, she's quite passionate about art and design for social change. She spearheads award-winning projects that promote sustainable development and educational awareness of global issues. Her strategic work fosters transdisciplinary, multi-level partnerships that bring positive change in local and international communities. With that, I have the pleasure of turning this over now to Professor Poggio to introduce our esteemed panelists and to get us ready for this afternoon's conversation. Professor Poggio.
Thank you so much, President Blanchard, for offering those words of welcome for this most important lecture series. President Blanchard's primary goal of his administration is to actualize the University of Houston downtown concentration on justice, racial, social, environmental, and financial, addressing the disparities that create barriers to fairness and success for the students who comprise the University of Houston downtown community and the future of Houston. We cannot accurately discuss the future of Houston if we do not tackle critical conversations around the environment, the current condition of our climate, and sustainability issues that we can employ to ensure an equitable and just future. This lecture series on justice, equity, and inclusion is an important conversation, and I'm honored to have it today with our expert panel as we discuss inclusive excellence, the way forward. A critical conversation on the Houston climate issue, environmental justice, and sustainability. I'm delighted to introduce our panel today. We are joined by Yvette Arellano, is a Mexican-American Gulf Coast organizer and emerging leader from Houston dedicated to environmental and racial justice. Yvette formerly served as a policy research and grassroots advocate with Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services and has founded an environmental justice advocacy group based in Houston, Texas, called Fence Line Watch. Fence Line Watch is dedicated to the eradication of toxic multi-generational harm on communities living along the fence line of industry. In 2015, they led the campaign against H.R. 702, which opened the floodgates to U.S. crude oil exports. They were instrumental in the publication Double Jeopardy in Houston, Air Toxins and Hell in the Houston Community of Manchester, and Plastic and Health, The Hidden Cost of a Plastic Planet. This report highlights the disproportionate toxic impact of the petrochemical industry on communities living on the fence line. Welcome, Yvette. Next, we have Dr. Ayanna Jolivet McLeod, is the Executive Director of Bayou City Waterkeeper, known as BCWK, where she works on wetland protection and urban water management, promoting nature-based systems centering equity and supporting community efforts to improve water quality. Before joining BCWK, she worked at Houston Botanical Garden as Director of Education and Public Programs, overseeing the launch of the organization's first ever educational offerings. She's also an interdisciplinary artist and occasionally writes and makes art about nature, diaspora, and equity. Ayanna has led programs and mobilized resources at environmental and cultural institutions for over 20 years. She frames new ways of imagining and advocating for natural resources and environmental justice, which center creativity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and ecological diversity. Welcome. Then we have Ms. Bridget Murray. She established a nonprofit organization Achieving Community Tasks Successfully, doing business as ACTS, ACTS, in 2012 to support community activities in the areas of social and environmental justice. ACTS established the first Texas community-led air monitoring network in 2019, hosting 7 low-cost air monitors. ACTS as a community-based organization works with the local community schools, establishing urban gardens and providing support for robotics and drone education. Their work is supported through the application of citizen science and engage the community to be a part of the solution using data to support change. Welcome, Ms. Murray. Then we have Ms. Stephanie Badiga, I hope I pronounced it right, is Air Alliance Houston's Advocacy and Legal Director. She serves as an advocate before local, state, and federal courts and administrative bodies for Air Alliance Houston and the communities that they serve. Stephanie also provides in-house legal counsel and is developing AAH's Environmental Justice Leadership Lab. Stephanie holds a master's in public health from Georgia State University and a Juris Doctorate from Texas Southern University Thurgood Marshall School of Law. Before AAH, she worked for Harris County Public Health as a policy analyst, and prior to that, interned with Lone Star Legal Aid. Welcome, Stephanie. All right, so I'm very excited. This is the part that is less reading bios. Um, so, welcome to HD, everyone. We are all delighted to have you all here. As a bit of housekeeping, for those of you watching us virtually, hello, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions of our panelists. For those of you in person, we will have some time at the end for some questions. Please write them down. So now, let's get us into the discussion you all have gathered here today. So this is a question I have for all of you to start the conversation. In grounding ourselves in thinking through how we might work towards creating equitable communities, I'm curious about the moment we found ourselves, especially, we just finished the COP 26. So could you give us some insight into some of the most salient climate and environmental justice issues? I know this is a complex question, but with the diversity in backgrounds and advocacy work, we want to ensure that our audience is able to see the full picture of what lies ahead for us. Anyone? Maybe you prick the microphone.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having us, and thanks to President Blanchard for hosting this. It's a very bold thing to embrace these issues from your leadership, and it's really essential. I think that for me, I think the way that I would answer that question is to acknowledge the place that we are in and the city and region that we're in. I also want to, before I even acknowledge that, just acknowledge history of land and site and space, and that we forget to acknowledge when we talk about landscapes. And so just acknowledging indigenous history, enslaved people, and migrant people in shaping and creating this land and their labor. And that's a really important part of this conversation, because that also has led to a lot of inequities around environmental justice. If we don't acknowledge that history, then we can't understand equity, inequities especially. For me, I think that in this area, what's also really important for me and for Bayou City Waterkeeper is to acknowledge the ecological diversity. Greater Houston supports some of the highest ecological diversity in the country. And the irony of it is that we also have a lot of industry, and it's an irony that that many people in our city don't have access to the nature that our city provides. And so all the more reason, as we always talk about that we're the most diverse city culturally, we also need to talk about we're the most one of the most ecological diverse cities in the country, and that everyone has a right to access our nature. And so for us, I would like to see wetland protection and understand that that supports a lot of flood mitigation and flood protection for a lot of vulnerable communities. And there's a lot others, but I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you.
Houston is the home of the largest petrochemical complex in the entire nation. It's close to being the second largest in the world. We house over 400 different fossil fuel energy facilities in Houston, the greater Houston area. It's important that as we ended with COP26, and there's missing commitments largely unled by the global north, including the US, that Houston be at the epicenter of the issue of curbing the climate crisis. Having such a massive petrochemical hub, we also have massive emissions that go recorded and unrecorded. So it's important for our city to not only lead in pollution, but lead in a just transition. Lead in opening avenues to public transportation in a comparable way, instead of investing millions, if not more, on expanding highways and exacerbating a problem that cities like ours have helped to not only generate, but have benefited from in jobs, infrastructure, and our economy. And in doing so, we must protect our most vulnerable communities from the kind of impacts that would lead on through generations. What we know is that toxic impacts carry on. It's not just the exposures we face today, but unborn children, children that are still developing, facing developmental issues, neurological issues. The problem of an expanding petrochemical industry is something we must curb, we must stop, and we must transition over because our city has so much to lose. We've lost health, we've lost millions, billions, if not trillions, on closing down our ship channels because of the multitude of chemical disasters our area has faced. So doing that, we have to protect our most vulnerable. If we do not uplift fence line and frontline communities impacted by the chemical disasters and daily exposure, we're doing a disservice to our own community. So let our city not only lead in energy, but lead in transition and lead in protecting what has already been established as of October 8th, a human right in living within dignity and in a clean environment for our air, soil, and water.
So, in the context of climate and environmental issues currently, I first want to thank my fellow panelists for bringing this up, but I think it's really important that we note that there is almost always the same communities that are being impacted disproportionately, right? I think whenever we mention climate and environmental justice, it doesn't really seem to be an issue for certain communities until we really start to look at it. And so I'm very thankful that it's been brought up. But I think vulnerable populations, low income community of colors, those are the communities that are burdened disproportionately. And so what that looks like, and I think for Houston, our most, I would say, salient issue, but I'm kind of biased, I'm in air quality, is the air pollution here in Houston, right? And I think outside of the context of air pollution, it's been mentioned, there's so many industries here, right? There's like over 500 industrial sites, and they're all kind of concentrated in these low income and community of color. And I think when we start to think about, you know, the greater vision of what climate is going to look like and climate issues, I think we're looking at droughts, we're looking at famine. And I think once that starts to happen and starts to kind of hit Texas, I think that we'll still see that disproportionate impact, right? I think it'll first affect these communities of color. So just like she's mentioned, the fossil fuels, I think there needs to be a lot of mitigation. And I think that can start with Houston and specifically Texas. But I think we would be kind of remiss to make sure that we lay the foundation that these effects of climate and environmental justice, they're affecting communities of color and low-income communities the most.
Again, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for this invitation. So I'm sitting here and I would like to speak from the perspective of communities. So much has been said about how climate impacts us all through fossil fuels. But when you think about low-income communities, as the community that I live in as well, that we see direct impacts, and that forms my opinion around environmental justice. So our need to have our own monitoring for our community was important. Our need to try to train and educate others within the community, that's important, because if you don't understand these impacts, then you are subject to repeat offenses. You're always going back to governmental entities asking for things, but you're not able to prove your point. So we're looking towards identifying our own data so that we can basically bring about change, work with others, collaborate. And so these are some of the things that we are concerned with in our work.
Thank you very much for those insightful comments. The next question, all of you could answer, but I'm like thinking in the word justice, and since Stephanie is a Juris Doctor, what does true climate and environmental justice look like? If you have to make an elevator pitch.
So I think when we talk about the concept of justice, I think it's first important to understand equity, or I guess in this situation, inequity. But environmental justice is making sure that there is environmental equity, right? And so what that looks like is meaningful involvement. So kind of like was mentioned, when we have state agencies that are in charge of our environment and dealing with the different things here, I think there needs to be more public participation, right? And I think that these agencies need to make sure that communities are included in a very meaningful way, right? That means, for example, when they do give their input, that input is taken very seriously. It's not kind of like to check the mark, like, oh yes, we did invite these communities, but it's like you invited them, they gave their input, and it was disregarded or it wasn't even considered in your rule or decision making, right? And then the other part of that is the fair treatment, right? And so we're trying to make sure, I think anyway, that not one community is impacted like more than the others, right? So one community, because of their income or because they're low English proficient or, you know, their color of their skin, should have a different environmental experience. I think everyone should have access to the same information, to the same public spaces, all that. And when we're talking about justice, I just think that it's making sure that we are protecting environmental equity.
Thank you. I also was thinking, given your experience, Ayanna, that you've been working with the Houston Botanical Gardens and also now at the Bayou City Waterkeeper. Thank you. It's a long name. What is like how you see this true climate and environmental justice? What do you think? Again, like the elevator pitch version. For these, how you would like resume it?
Sure. You know, I forgot to correct you. I am not a doctor. And it says that I'm a doctor in my bio, but I forgot to correct you. So I wanted to just backtrack and say that. I would say that for me, what I've learned is that it must center holism, okay? And it needs to be interconnected. The beauty of environmental justice is that there's so many people entering the work from different angles. So there's different access points. We can all enter it from different angles. Legal, science, creative, just the imagining of environment and to see the environment. You know, and irregardless, there's no hierarchy too, and that is the beauty of it. I think that, centering community and understanding, as we were just talking about how we activate community voices, and we provide a platform for community voices as well. Community has been fighting on, frontline communities have been fighting for quite some time. We know the history of environmental justice for decades. But then how do we listen to these histories and current narratives? And then how do we advocate and provide tools to community in order for them to move their causes forward? And, this happens through I don't say citizen science, I say community science, just because that's the language that feels really good to us, but just really centering community science efforts in community, and that's some of the things that we do at our organization. A specific example is I want someone to be able to say, a developer is coming into our community and they want to knock down our wetland. Then you should be able to identify the indicators of a wetland. You should say, this is a wetland because of this tree, this hydrology, this soil. That's what community science look like. That's a specific example of how we can center justice from a community-centered perspective.
Thank you very much. I like that you mentioned bringing all the disciplines, right? Like as an artist, I tackle environmental issues from my perspective. So yes. So the next question I thought about Bridget. Today is the start of the Houston Climate Week, as President Blanchard mentioned, an opportunity to learn and discuss about relevant issues in Houston. What are some of the most salient issues impacting residents in Harris County?
Well, let me just share a current situation that we're dealing with. So in the Pleasantville community, we have become highly industrialized. At one point, it was most primarily a residential area, but we're more industrialized, basically because we have no zoning in the city of Houston. But we have landowners' property that has been basically contaminated by groundwater, contaminated groundwater. And so in our effort to address some of these issues, as the city is considering allowing the companies to have what they refer to as an MSD or municipal setting designation, we basically have been fortunate enough to be able to hire our own experts to review the data that their technical experts are providing. And so we have been able to, if you will, push back against some of that information because, again, communities need to be protected. And until we are able to stand for ourselves, work with others, it's going to be a difficult situation. So it is basically a competitive or situation, whereas the city, of course, wants to grow, support businesses. We understand that. But at the same time, we have to also find that balance for communities.
Yeah, congratulations on having that support. And it's true, we have to grow responsibly, right? So the next question, as a follow-up, I thought about Yvette and your organization. How can the city of Houston work with the community to address longstanding environmental justice concerns in a holistic manner, especially when you were discussing about Fence Line Watch?
The city can stop selling property over to industrial partners. We've seen how pensions crunch and pressure different cities to find innovative and creative ways to come up with monies in order to meet those commitments for our first responders, whether it's the police or firefighters. What our police and firefighters and fence line communities need is active participation in chemical disaster policy development. And it's a place where the city of Houston has lacked leadership and can display a great amount of solidarity with federal efforts in order to establish more streamlined communications with first responders and communities, whether it's creating dedicated evacuation routes during chemical disasters, as we've seen in previous, whether it's Port Neches, Arkema, the TPC fires, it's just one too many to count. We don't have an active plan. Whenever my community goes into shelter in place, our major access routes get closed so that first responders can make their way to the scene as soon as possible. Whenever first responders get to the scene and community members like myself go and check on these situations, they have no information because there are policies in place that have shielded the information under Homeland Security to assure that there is at least security against terrorism. But where is the security for our communities? Where are the protected evacuation routes? Where are streamlined communications for first responders? All of these were commitments at the federal level that have already been made. And yet we see our city continuing to fall back when it comes to chemical disaster, and it doesn't put our air quality in a better place. Our city has never met Clean Air Act standards. And as one of the largest cities in our country, we must assure that the deadlines to meet state implementation policy requirements over the Clean Air Act get met, instead of allowing polluters a free pass to continue harming our most vulnerable communities. We can also begin establishing a language justice initiative so that communities that speak all languages, especially since we have such a large migrant community, have access to evacuation routes, updates during chemical disasters, and hurricanes. I believe strongly in this, especially since English is my second language. My community, the community I grew up in, which is Spanish speaking, does not have access to public participation, does not have access to chemicals in the air. Why? We have known the Hispanic population has been growing for a while now. Our Vietnamese population is extremely strong. How many more communities do we need to create translations for at the voting booth, but not give them access when it's most needed?
Thank you. As a second language speaker, I totally support that. So this is a question for all of you, and I'm asking you to be brief because we have a few more questions. So we are grateful for the advocacy work that each of you are doing and engaged. And I'm very interested in finding what was your aha moment when you realized that you wanted to dedicate your work to environmental and sustainability issues. And maybe Bridget, can you start first?
aha moment. It was several. But in 1995, there was a warehouse fire within steps of our community that burned for 3 full weeks with TCQ, City of Houston Fire Department there on the scene for 3 full weeks, and the community not being aware of what was burning in that warehouse fire. So that was one aha moment. The second aha moment was when we started in the community having these conversations about smells and respiratory conditions. So as you can see, these things build up. They don't happen overnight, but when you are basically, as a former registered nurse, you have to take into consideration health impacts, what's going on in your immediate area, and what's happening to the people that you live near. So those were our aha moments to want to do something on behalf of the community in the area of environmental justice.
I would say that I didn't necessarily have an aha moment. I was in grad school and I knew at some point it was going to end up being public health. I just wasn't quite sure what realm of public health. And so, I know I got to law school and I kept thinking, well, how is this going to, relate back to public health? And I just knew it was going to be health law. I just knew I was going to be working in a hospital. And so I ended up interning with Lone Star in their environmental division just to kind of I was trying to check off boxes that I absolutely was not going to do, and here I am. But I ended up interning for them, and they were working on a landfill. It was like Greenhouse Road or some landfill like that. And, in law school, they kind of teach you the different ways. You can go criminal, you can go family, but they don't ever really stop to say like, oh, here's this little tiny fraction that is really, really important, but we're not going to really funnel you that way. And so when I started to intern with them, I just kind of started learning about the cancer clusters in Fifth Ward and all these different industrial facilities being literally neighbors to churches and, these nursing homes. And I was just like, what is happening? And so that was kind of my moment to kind of recognize where I wanted to be and what the type of work that I wanted to do.
As a person of color, in Indigenous advocacy, in migrant advocacy, our existence is resistance. We are taught to grow our medicines, we're taught herbalism, but finding out that growing essential herbs, yerba buena, chamomile, anything, could potentially be toxic because our soils were saturated with toxics. Because growing up in an elementary school and going to the playground on rainy days and seeing green water spew from the edges after living in an area that is a historically Black community that suffers from the largest amount of legacy contamination, that's Acres Home here in Houston, that was not an aha moment, but it was a dedication to say, this needs to change. It was the moment that I went to a 3-year-old's funeral, with people continuing to think, go to school and you'll do better, get a good job, work hard. But when you die of leukemia at the age of 3, what is the potential? Where is the opportunity? Our communities are being cut off from our future. They're being rendered sterile as reproductive issues continue to grow. So understanding that our future is at stake is what did it for me.
Yeah, I think it wasn't necessarily an aha moment, but it was just probably, I'm a native Houstonian, and I grew up in a lot of working class neighborhoods on the southeast and southwest side. And my memories of being in Houston are, a lot of folks from Houston, especially, from back in the day, it's rural and it's urban. It's a combination. And I just have all these great memories of like playing in green space, not knowing the history of those places. One of the neighborhoods I grew up in was Sunnyside. Did know the history of the landfill in Sunnyside, but the thing that really sparked me was Harvey. That really did create a lot of trauma for me, because my connection to my city changed, and it reminded me that what our city is not set up to support flood resilience, and it also opened my eyes to flood inequities and inequities that happen, especially around flood recovery, because there's people that are still recovering from Harvey right now. It really hurt me so deeply to know that we should be able to support this, but we cannot support this. And so that was the thing that kind of sparked me. And I will say one other thing is that I'm coming at this from two angles, from an environmental justice angle, but also from a conservation angle. Working at the Botanic Garden, one of the things is it's all about acknowledging these different plants and histories. For me, I became really interested to say, well, who's not around the table? Well, what about Black and brown folks? Why can't we? Why are we not talking about conservation, horticulture, and botany from those perspectives? But it is because of systemic racism, and I'm interested in linking EJ and conservation because we belong in both, and I think that is a narrative that I don't see enough people of color centered in conservation, but there's a lot of folks in conservation that are centering EJ. And so it's interesting to see this layering, but for me, it was through a few access points that I've arrived here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those comments. So as we are like getting closer to our time to end, I want to share. So there's this last week there was a TED fellow, Bristol Bogon. She said in a conference that in our society we have a definition of success that is making the planet sick. How do we shift from what we are comfortable with? Our culture of consumption, etc., to the new norms that support a true balance of sustainability pillars. That by that I mean economic, environmental, and social goals. And for that, I would like to ask Ms. Murray and then Yvette, and please be short.
So this particular question is quite difficult for me because we live in a state where individuals have not come to accept the idea of climate change. They have not come to accept environmental justice. So when you think about a shift, where do you start? Do you start at the community level, just educating and training? And for me, I think that's where our focus has been. Because if people, it's great that the city of Houston has a recycling program, but if you've listened to the news, a lot of what's being put in the recycle bins is not recyclable. So why can't we start there? Why can't the city initiate more pilot programs throughout different communities where they're seeing most of these problems so that we start at the bottom? Because the top right now is still having some issues. Thank you.
And Yvette, just briefly.
Toxics. Our city can and should tackle toxics in our air. It's been too long of an excuse to say that X plant is in Pasadena or in Baytown when we continue to suffer through the impacts of these chemical disasters. And so instead of continuing the conversation, not that it's not important, on greenhouse gases, we need to come to a realization that a true conversation on volatile organic compounds, whether it's benzene, formaldehyde, you name it, it needs to be on our radar. And partnering up with Harris County's efforts to create a monitoring network that stands alone apart from the TCQ is a great place to start, because we are also part of Harris County, and Harris County is doing some immense steps on really tackling toxics issues.
Thank you very much. This was a very educational conversation, and I've been getting cues that we have to move into the Q&A, right? No? Oh, okay. Sorry. I am misunderstanding the signs. I cannot read lips and then pay attention. I cannot multitask that much. Sorry. Krishima is master handling everything. So we have then one more question. Yay! And this one I planned for Stephanie. So environmental justice is an issue that impacts everyone. From your perspective, what is a starting point for those listening today who are looking for ways to engage in the social justice fight?
I would say just kind of start anywhere. I don't know. It sounds disorganized. But I think when we talk about environmental justice, I think people forget that environmental justice is very comprehensive, right? I think that when we start talking about why certain communities are having adverse and disparate impacts, there needs to be like a greater conversation about I guess, the lack of political power, right? The history, the oppression, all these things. And so when I tell people just kind of start anywhere, it depends on, what your focus is when you talk about environmental justice, right? And so for me, it's making sure that I'm of service to any community that needs any type of legal representation, right? That's the whole point of me going to law school. And so for others, it might be that they're focused solely on state agencies like TCEQ not, properly enforcing some of these permits. For others, it might look like Title VI intentional discrimination lawsuits, right? Because people are, we're understanding now that a lot of these adverse impacts are intentional, right? And so I think it depends where you want to start. But for students specifically, I always say just reach out. Air Alliance loves hosting interns. We like teaching. We like, collaborating. And so we've worked with Bayou City Waterkeeper, and, one of their staff, Kristen, was a huge mentor to me. And I'm just thankful that I reached out. But I reached out not knowing a single thing. I reached out like, where do I start? And she was like, well, pick a place. And so I think whether it's water, whether it's land use, whether, it's just you want the civil rights aspect, it depends. You just kind of start. You do some research. You see, where am I located? What industrial facilities next to my home? Like, who's being impacted? These cancer clusters, why have they been around? Why is there still industries in there? I mean, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole when it comes to environmental justice. So if you want to start, reach out to Air Alliance or any one of these organizations, and we're happy to point you in whatever direction you'd like to go.
Thank you. Yes, I think that especially being a university community, we have lots of students interested in internships and opportunities. So yes, sure.
I'd like to add that November 16th at 2 p.m., the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality is having their final meeting on public participation and opening it up for Spanish speakers. What we need is participation from everyone listening virtually, everyone here presently, to show up to this meeting. And you can learn more either on TCQ's website, or please visit www.fencelinewatch.org, and we will have different points you can help push on, because we need professional interpreters, and the state is trying to implement voluntary services from Spanish speakers in their staff. So let's give our other speaking communities the dignity they deserve when they come to state agency meetings like we do English speakers. And I invite everyone to participate. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. So now this has been a very educational conversation. We will now take a few questions from our audience, and Dr. Krishima Morai will take it over.
Thank you so much. And the signals were just that we have more time to engage in conversations. And so we didn't want you all to feel the pressure to rush through. But this gives us more opportunity to not only take questions from our audience, but we have questions from our virtual audience that have come through. Some of them are specific to certain speakers, and then others are general for the entire panel, and we have about 10 minutes for those questions left. So I'll begin. This question was specific for Ayanna, but it's open to others to address as well. What are some of the additional issues that are impacting Harris County? Social justice and environmental justice issues.
From a water issue, I'll just say that I spoke a lot about wetlands, and so kind of that was the founding of our organization 20 years ago, where we were about protecting wetlands and intersecting science through with law. And so that's one, is we just have to do that, because that supports flood resiliency, and also it supports so much biodiversity that is needed for the health of our city. Clean water is also a really important issue, and we actually successfully sued the city of Houston, and so because we saw that we had a lot of sanitary sewer overflows in a lot of communities, and so now I believe it's the city is required to work over the next 5 years and with $2 billion in water infrastructure to repair the water infrastructure in different communities in order to sort of protect clean water. And then the other piece is flood resilience and flood equity. And so we do a lot of work behind the scenes around just how we respond, sort of just recovery. Working with a lot of frontline communities to advocate for equity around flood recovery and also centering nature-based solutions in flood recovery.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to tackle that question that didn't have a chance to speak? Okay, thank you. So the next question, this group is extremely knowledgeable about the issues that are impacting our city, our county, as well as our nation. And we are very thankful that you all were able to address these issues. What can members of the University of Houston downtown community do to learn more about how we can be better advocates for our space in terms of our air, our land, and our water?
If I could take this one. So I guess I'll answer a part of that question, and hopefully the panelists can kind of divvy the rest. But I think it was mentioned earlier, kind of the recycling issue. And so I'm from Portland, Oregon. And so when I walked in here, I kind of noticed there's no like recycling blue cans. And so I think just a very small start is to have things like that. There should be recycling bins in the schools. Like, I don't think it would, be this huge burden, but it's little things like that, kind of looking at our own space and looking internally and saying, hey, what can this very specific community be doing that it's not already, right? Looking at other, universities from different demographics and, different regions and saying, okay, well, they're doing this and it's impacting them in the best ways possible. And then I had kind of spoken about earlier, internships with students, but I think it's also important that the universities or their educational institutes are also funding these internships, right? I think we as academia kind of send students into these like, well, it's unpaid, but, give your 40 hours. And I think that's very unfair and that's very deterring anyway from like pursuing things like internships that revolve around environmental justice. Most of the time, schools are not willing to fund that. And so I think that would be a good start, is kind of looking internally at organizations, at communities, and seeing, how the institution itself could be better.
Thank you.
I would add to that, I've already said it before, but fencelinewatch.org, we consistently update about upcoming TCQ meetings, even visiting the TCQ site. You would be astonished to see that no one shows up to meetings about their health, about the air, water, and soil. Those schedules are regularly posted. Being an active member of the commissioners' meetings for Harris County and being involved in the process, whether it's speaking up for your community or bringing others to participate. Offering translation services to folks who also participate in these meetings. So this, I'm calling on our multicultural centers, whether it's Mecca, it's TBH, it's the Asian Community Center in Bel Air. Come and bring your resources. Calling on our medical center, because not only are we home to the largest petrochemical complex in the nation, but we're home of the largest medical center. How is it that we're honing in on these resources and not making them available during chemical disasters? Because after chemical disasters, tests in order to prove that these toxins are in our blood are $300 a piece for a family of 4. Now imagine those costs. So where are the programs to make sure that we have people on the ground offering these services and giving these families an opportunity to have a proper buyout out of fenceline and frontline communities in order to live a healthier, better life for themselves and their children? So be an active participant. Learn what's going on in our communities. Make sure you're a part of the civic associations and uplifting those efforts too, because involvement begins at all levels, but just because you're not an attorney and you're not a doctor doesn't mean you don't have a voice. And in fact, not being an attorney, not being a doctor, but an affected person, your voice is the most powerful in the entire room, and you are the specialist on the issues that touch your life.
Thank you. We have another question from a UHD staff member, Deborah Evans. Most recycling materials come through the shipping, receiving, mailroom department. How can I market to UHD community on the benefits of sustainability, recycling, clean recycling?
We first have to invest in the infrastructure for recycling, especially because Houston has over 235 plastic polluting facilities within our industrial complex. So being able to engage a little bit more on making sure that these plastic facilities turn off the tap and no future plastics get created or generated is a good place to start. Because once the plastic is created, it's there forever. Once the facilities get put in place, they're there for 40, 60, even 100 years if we look at industries like LyondellBasell. But as far as transitioning over to a better infrastructure for recycling, placing a tax on these industries that are creating the problem so that taxpayers don't have to worry about increases. We didn't start this problem. We shouldn't have to pay for this problem. So assuring that those investments happen and are part of our Houston Just Transition Plan so that we aren't burdened with those costs that we didn't create.
I'll also say I've done a little research into environmental psychology, and so one of the tips that I would recommend too is it's quite overwhelming to talk about these topics, and so a lot of times you never know, especially in a place like UHD, everyone is already experiencing so many other things. Folks have jobs, have families. This is the beauty of UHD, but let's acknowledge that. And so I found this in my talking about environment, like that's huge. And then you talk about environmental justice and recycling and like acknowledging that this is so much bigger than you individually. So like there's so many corporate kind of folks that are responsible for this issue, industry folks. But what I like to do is remind people of the small impact that they make. If you do not put that one bottle in recycling, being reminded numbers-wise, well, how does this impact a larger kind of system? And so it's helpful just to do a little research around impact. What happens if the number of people at UHD, consider how many people, students, faculty are at UHD, and how many people are consuming, however many, but just do a little research and then remind people whenever they go onto near recycling containers, whatever, this is what your impact is. And so it becomes personalized and it's less abstract. And that's psychologically, you feel like you're doing something. So I feel like that's a good way to approach it if the professor is interested in creating change.
Thank you. Okay, last question. In the 90s, the state of Texas led a campaign to reduce the amount of vehicles on Texas roadways in non-attainment areas with carpooling and mass transit incentive efforts for companies with over 100 employees. This seemed to be working, but like many things, this did not last. The HOV lanes were built to aid in this, but these lanes began to allow one-passenger vehicles to pay extra to get on. This was seen on the Katy Freeway first, then it spread to all other HOV lanes. Does anyone know of plans to encourage this incentive again?
I mean, I think this is a larger issue. We need to have a planner on this panel because that's a lot to ask of us. But I will say, being a native Houstonian, this is a larger cultural issue. We love our cars. Okay, and so much of our identity is shaped by our cars, and how we interact with environment is also shaped by our cars. And so it might be interesting to approach this from a cultural perspective, and just acknowledge trying to kind of create that bridge between Houstonians and our cars is a whole nother thing. But I'd love to have a planner be able to answer this question, because I feel like that's really more within that scope.
And then this is kind of, I guess, out of the way, but also on topic with transportation. And so I know that there is the NHHIP, the I-45 expansion. And so there's a lot about that project that is just not okay. But I think that project in general kind of gives you a look at, I guess, our culture around, sustainability. We like to say that, you know, we want to be sustainable, but when we look at different agencies, who has an open and written statement to environmental justice, right? Who has an open and written statement about sustainability? Who that has that statement is actually implementing it in practice, right? But instead, we're deciding that we're going to expand the freeway, I guess, to solve our traffic problem. And then in doing that, displace a bunch of homes, communities, churches. And so I think when we're talking about, you know, the city wanting to be sustainable, I think that we also need to have a very real conversation about what our priorities are as a city.
With the highways conversation, it's important to also reflect back on Houston's history. We had a robust public transportation system. We had 2 monorails. They're a part of Houston's history, and they got closed down in order to expand the highway systems. We had a TURP program to allow rebates for people who couldn't afford to upgrade their vehicles and make sure that they passed the emissions test. Where are those monies going to now? Making sure that those monies continue to be directed in those ways, also offering people, everyday people, an opportunity to buy hybrid and mixed energy vehicles or all electric vehicles is important. Making sure that we continue to offer opportunities to our students. I graduated from UH main campus myself, and I remember we used to have discounted rates so that we could access public transportation, and they were done away with 2 years before 2008. So trying to recommission some of those programs, whether it's the updating vehicles program, no longer expanding, offering more public transportation. And I'm sure we all were familiar with how our current rail system simply went from one end of downtown to the next. It was not comprehensive, and we have made so much traction and progress since then. But where is the city of Houston in connecting those rails to the airports, which has been a long-standing project? So let's increase our public transportation, divest from single-use vehicle options, and encourage students to pave a way for the future and a love of public transportation systems.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions from the audience, but we want to thank our live audience for these questions, but we want to respect the time and allow closing remarks from all panelists. And so I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, Krishima. So thank you for the questions from the audience. Those were great. And next time, urban planner. To wrap up, could you, our 4 panelists, could you give us some final words on, you know, this was a great dialogue, and now how we could move forward? I'll start with you, Yvette, since you were like the last one to speak.
It's not all hope is lost, I'd say that. The state of Texas has finally accepted a Title VI civil rights complaint that is now 3 years in the making. And we will be one of the first southern states to establish language justice amendments within our state as an oil and gas state. So assuring that we are part of the future, and by we, I mean an all-inclusive building of this future, is possible, is in the works. It needs participation. It needs your participation, encouragement, motivation, and most of all, bring along somebody with you, because it takes people to create change. And the more that we have, the better change we have for all of us.
Okay, I can. So for me, I think that it's important to remember. I'm very thankful to have been, you know, asked to speak on this panel, but I think that it's also really important to recognize that when we're talking about issues surrounding environmental justice, I think the best way to start would be to actually reach out to community, right? I think the best way to start would be to look into these communities that are facing these issues and maybe start there and have a roundtable talk with them, see how the institutions can actually help them. Like, I think it's important to have panelists like us, but I also think it's really, really important to create space for these community members and to let them know that there are institutions that are thinking about them, working with them, thinking through all the issues that they're facing, and to also provide guidance to them if there's something that we know that they're lacking. I think that institutions are more than equipped with being able to help with our environmental justice issues. I think it would be really helpful if institutions would reach out to nonprofits and say, hey, how can we help? What can we do to, guide these communities? Can we have students go around and go, door to door? I mean, when it's safer, um, to kind of help with what the issues are. I'm always wondering, like, when we talk about these communities, I always wonder, like, has anyone actually ever done like a site visit? Has anyone ever thought through what the bigger issues are? So, very briefly, I think when people think environmental justice, they don't really understand the full impact, but property and wealth is one of them, right? So imagine your house is right next to a concrete batch plant and every day it's super foggy when you're trying to leave. Like, how much could you really sell your house for? Where does that wealth go that you spent into your house? So it's things like that where it's like they don't even have the resources at this point because industry has kind of, turned this property and this wealth into something that's not very usable. And so I think when hosting discussions like this, I would really encourage everyone to create space for those community members and also institute remedial measures and, offer grants and, different funding and things like that. But again, I'm really thankful to have been asked to speak on this panel.
So I'd like to leave you also with the thought that there is hope in this effort. And when you decide to work with nonprofits, decide to work on climate change or environmental justice, remember to bring your passion, because every day is not a win day. Every day is not a lose day. But if you can bring that passion that reminds you of why you're working for the people that you live near or who you're supporting, you want to be able to understand that it was the passion that drives the work, and it's also what will keep you in the work. So thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll say, for me, to embrace imagination and rethink the framing and the naming of things. We've been kind of given a language on what environment is, what environmental justice is. And what we've learned in recent years through things such as Black Lives Matter, we've learned of the interconnectedness of justice across environment and race and class and all these different scopes. And we've had to reopen, kind of revisit the boundaries of what justice is. And I also embrace naming, understanding where we are. Know your watershed. Everyone lives in a watershed. Do you know like what your subwatershed is? Do you know where your subwatershed drains into? Like, this is how we access clean water. Like, name your bayous and name the injustices. And see nature along with people and see the inequities and don't be afraid to see the inequities. I'll say that it can be very exhausting and we have to center care and be gentle with ourselves but go hardcore at the same time. So embrace pauses in the work and acknowledge the people that have come before us because it makes the labor, the lift a little less heavier when you are working in collaboration and in solidarity with people who've come before you or people who are doing the work. And so those are my points.
Thank you very much for sharing all of your wonderful insights about a more just environment future. Houston is no stranger to the impacts of climate change, but we are also on the front lines of the solutions to mitigate the short and long-term effects. This transformation will take more than technical solutions. It calls for different ways of seeing and being. The pandemic has led to an awakening, the realization that everything is connected, that ecological healing and social justice are one unified idea. We can have peace with the earth when we practice justice with each other by creating healthier, thriving, more equitable communities. And this begins with all of us. Well, our time together has ended. I am most thankful for our wonderful panelists for sharing their knowledge and passion with us. I want to thank everyone who tuned in today and those here present for our third lecture as part of UHD's President's Lecture. And on that note, thank you, Dr. Blanchard, for supporting this informative President's Lecture series on justice, equity, and inclusion. We have more events like this coming up in the future, so please check your emails. We have lots of emails, and UHD News for dates and topics. We hope you and your families are healthy. Thank you very much.